This content is for educational purposes only and does not constitute legal or medical advice. Laws, regulations, and standards of care vary by jurisdiction. Consult qualified legal counsel for advice specific to your situation. Every day you practice medicine, you are generating forensic evidence. Your EHR logs when you opened the chart and how long you spent in it. Your badge records when you entered and left the building. Your phone is pinging the nearest cell tower every few minutes. Your carrier is logging every call and text, the time, the duration, the tower it routed through. You are not thinking about any of this. You are thinking about the patient in front of you. But 3 years from now, sitting in a deposition, an attorney will reconstruct your day from those records, minute by minute, and compare it to your sworn testimony. And if your memory of that day doesn't match the digital record, the jury won't care about the medicine. They'll care about the inconsistency. This is the Charted Defense. I'm Brian.
I'm Sarah.
And I'm Michael. Today we're talking about the digital witness, the collection of independent, time-stamped records that are building a parallel account of everything you do during a clinical shift. Cell tower pings, text message metadata, EHR audit trails, login timestamps, time on chart data. These records exist whether you think about them or not, and in litigation they speak louder than you do.
Michael, walk us through the full digital trail a physician leaves during a typical shift.
Let's start with the EHR because that's the one most physicians have some awareness of, even if they underestimate it. Every time you open a patient's chart, the system logs the timestamp. It logs which sections you accessed, notes, labs, imaging, medications. It logs how long you spent in each section. It logs when you created a note, when you modified it, when you signed it, and it captures the delta, the gap between the clinical encounter and the documentation. If you saw the patient at 2 a.m. and didn't write the note until 4 a.m., that 2-hour gap is in the audit trail. A study by Sittig and Wright published in the Journal of Healthcare Risk Management in 2023 laid out exactly what modern EHR systems capture. Epic, Oracle Health, Meditech. They all maintain comprehensive logs of every access event, every modification, the workstation and IP address used, and the authenticated user or GD. This data is immutable. You cannot alter the audit trail itself.
And outside the EHR?
Your hospital badge creates a separate timeline. Entry and exit swipes at the building, at restricted units, at the physician lounge. That data is maintained by the security system, not the EHR. It's a completely independent record. Your cell phone is the third timeline. Your carrier logs every call and text with timestamps and cell tower routing data. From that, an expert can determine your approximate geographic location at any given time during the day. Were you at the hospital? Were you at home? Were you somewhere else entirely? And then there are text messages themselves. The content of your texts lives on your device, the recipient's device, cloud backups, and in some cases the carrier's servers. Deleting a text from your phone does not erase it from existence. Multiple malpractice insurers have flagged this as one of the most dangerous misconceptions among physicians.
Sarah, how routine is it for plaintiffs' attorneys to subpoena all of this?
It's standard practice, and probably even more widespread than published data suggests. Cellular billing records are subpoenaed directly from the carrier. EHR audit trails are subpoenaed separately from the clinical record itself. And text messages are pursued through every available pathway: the physician's device, the recipient's device, cloud providers, carrier metadata. A landmark case out of Illinois, Prieto versus Rush University Medical Center, established that EHR audit trail data is fully discoverable and separate from the medical record. The health system resisted production. The court's response was a sanction entering judgment of liability in favor of the patient before the medical care was ever evaluated. The defense lost the case on the audit trail battle alone. That was a precedent-setting moment for the entire industry. Every health system, every defense attorney, every risk manager took notice. Audit trail data is coming out in discovery. The only question is whether it helps or hurts.
And the critical point is that none of these data sources talk to each other, but they can all be laid side by side. The EHR audit trail is maintained by the health system. The cell tower records are maintained by the carrier. The badge data is maintained by hospital security. The text messages may exist across multiple devices and servers. No single person controls all of them. So when you sit for a deposition and recount your version of events, there are multiple independent digital records that will either confirm or contradict your account.
Let's go deeper on the EHR audit trail specifically, because this is where physicians are most exposed without realizing it. Michael, what does time on chart data look like in litigation?
Here's a scenario every hospitalist will recognize. It's a busy night. You see a patient, do your assessment, give orders, and then you get pulled to another patient. You don't get back to document the first encounter for an hour or two. Clinically, that's normal. The care was delivered in real time. The note came later. But the audit trail shows the gap. It shows when you open the chart, when you created the note, and the precise delta between the encounter and the documentation. In litigation, that gap becomes a question you answer under oath. Doctor, why did it take you 2 hours to document this encounter? Were you unsure of your assessment? Were you constructing a narrative after the fact? The answer is almost always benign. You were busy with other patients, but the optics in a courtroom are not benign.
And it gets more specific than that. In one Alabama federal case, Benson versus Bia BHW-BMC, the hospital's audit trail reportedly showed that a physician had viewed a patient's chart for 11 seconds before applying their electronic signature. 11 seconds. That is not enough time to read a single progress note, let alone synthesize a patient's history, labs, and imaging. If that physician testified to conducting a thorough chart review, the 11-second timestamp makes that testimony impossible to sustain.
Templated documentation compounds the problem. If you use a pre-populated template that generates neurological exam intact or review of systems negative times 14, but the audit trail shows you were in the chart for 3 minutes total, a plaintiff's attorney will establish that you could not possibly have performed what the template claims. The template becomes evidence of a perfunctory evaluation, not a thorough one. Now, there are legitimate reasons a chart session might be short. You may have examined the patient at the bedside before opening the EMR. You may have done a chart review before rounding and then documented later in a separate session. In those cases, the audit trail should show a second entry where the actual documentation was placed. The key is that your workflow pattern should be explainable and consistent. If your audit trail routinely shows a brief morning review session followed by a longer documentation session after rounding, that pattern is defensible, but if it shows a single 3-minute session with a comprehensive template note and nothing else, that's a problem. What the EHR audit trail doesn't just record what you documented, it records how long you spent doing it, and that duration data can either validate your testimony or demolish it.
Sarah, how are plaintiffs' attorneys using this strategically?
They're building demonstrative exhibits. Imagine a timeline graphic shown to the jury. On one axis, the physician's testimony about what they did and when. On the other axis, the audit trail timestamps, the badge swipes, the cell tower pings. Every inconsistency is highlighted. The jury doesn't need medical expertise to read that graphic. They need a clock. Matthew Caris, a defense attorney writing in the Journal of Healthcare Risk Management in 2022, put it directly. Medical malpractice cases now effectively contain 2 claims, one on the medicine and one on the electronic health record. The audit trail has become a second battlefield, and for some physicians, it has proven more dangerous than the clinical facts.
This is the part that makes physicians uncomfortable, because it doesn't require anyone to be lying.
Exactly. Think about what a deposition asks you to do. You're sitting in a conference room 3 or 4 years after the events. You're being asked to reconstruct minute by minute what you did on a specific day. You may have seen 20 patients that week. You may have worked 5 overnight shifts that month. The attorney wants you to pin down times, locations, the sequence of phone calls, which conversation happened before which decision. And you're doing this from memory, honest memory. You believe what you're saying, but human memory consolidates, compresses, and rearranges events. You might genuinely remember being at the hospital when a phone call happened, when in fact you had already left. You might conflate two conversations into one. None of this is deception, it is how memory works. But here's something physicians need to hear, even though it's uncomfortable. Sometimes the reason you left the hospital looks bad on its face. You left for a vacation, a shopping trip, a family event. The instinct in a deposition is to avoid admitting that, to say you were still at the hospital, still working. But if your cell tower data or badge swipe records show you were somewhere else, that instinct just destroyed your credibility. The better approach, and I cannot stress this enough, is honesty. Explain that your group has cross-coverage agreements, that there is a dedicated physician on call every day, that your departure was within normal clinical workflow, and the patient's care was being actively managed by a qualified colleague. That is a perfectly reasonable answer. Most juries understand that physicians have schedules, that groups have coverage models, and that leaving the hospital does not mean abandoning a patient. Most of us don't think about our personal lives being scrutinized in litigation, but we should plan ahead for how to answer these questions. An honest answer that sounds mundane is infinitely better than a dishonest answer that sounds good.
The legal reality is stark. When a plaintiff's attorney puts the physician's sworn testimony on one side of a demonstrative exhibit and the cell tower data on the other, the jury sees a simple question. Did the doctor tell the truth? They don't process it as a memory error. They process it as a lie. And once they decide the physician was dishonest about where they were, they start asking why. The answer the plaintiff provides is always the same, because the physician had somewhere else to be. And that motive narrative, the doctor was in a hurry, is easier for a jury to understand than any amount of competing expert testimony about clinical decision-making.
That is the devastating part. The credibility question gets settled first. The medical arguments are heard through that lens. If the jury thinks you're a careful physician who made a difficult call, they'll give you the benefit of the doubt. If they think you're a physician who cut corners because you had somewhere to be, every expert opinion you offer sounds like a rationalization.
Let's talk specifically about text messaging, because this is where physicians create problems without realizing it.
Text messages are discoverable through multiple independent pathways: the physician's device, the recipient's device, cloud backups, and carrier metadata. And unlike a chart note, texts are informal. They capture the unfiltered version of what you were thinking, how you were communicating, and what your attitude was toward the case. Published insurer case studies from ProAssurance and NorCal have documented exactly how this plays out in litigation. Here's what I tell physicians. First, do not discuss patient identifying information via personal text message. It violates HIPAA unless you're using a HIPAA-compliant messaging platform. And most personal texting apps are not compliant. The best practice is simply not to text about patients on personal devices. Second, if you must communicate clinical information by text, keep it professional and factual. The same standard you would apply to a chart note. No editorializing, no venting, no flippant comments about patients or colleagues. No sarcasm, no frustration. No offhand remarks about how a case is going. Third, understand that from a plaintiff's attorney's standpoint, text messages are one of the easiest sources of data to impeach a defendant. In the unusual event that your personal texts become evidence, derogatory or editorial comments will destroy your credibility. Fourth, whenever possible, use your institution's HIPAA-compliant messaging platform. Those systems are designed for clinical communication, they're subject to institutional policies, and they create a record within the system rather than scattered across personal devices.
I'll add a practical example. ProAssurance published a case study where it recovered text messages between a nurse and a nurse practitioner systematically dismantled the NP's sworn deposition testimony. The NP testified that the patient's hand appeared normal, but a text sent minutes later explicitly described it as cool. The NP testified she was unaware a Doppler had been ordered, but a text from the nurse explicitly notified her. At every point, the digital evidence contradicted the sworn testimony. That case didn't turn on whether the clinical care was appropriate. It turned on the fact that the NP's own text messages proved her testimony was wrong.
And Norkel Group published a companion case where a surgeon managed a post-operative wound infection primarily through text messages, replying to patient texted photos with shorthand like, "looks good," and "you" for you. When the patient developed osteomyelitis requiring amputation, the surgeon had never documented any of these text-based clinical interactions in the chart. The formal record completely contradicted the timeline established by the texts.
The lesson is not don't text. The lesson is that your texts can become part of the medical legal record whether you want them to or not. If you're making clinical decisions over text, those decisions will be judged by the same standard as decisions in the chart. And if the chart says one thing and your texts say another, the inconsistency defines the case.
Michael, bring this home. 5 actionable practices.
First, assume your digital footprint is discoverable. Phone records, EHR, timestamps, badge swipes, text messages, all of it. Before any deposition, consider asking your attorney to obtain your own digital records if you think they may be relevant to your circumstances. Never rely on memory alone to reconstruct a timeline that digital evidence can verify or disprove. Second, never let external schedules drive clinical disposition. If a patient needs to be admitted, admit them. If you need to leave, transfer care to a colleague. And if you're later asked why you left the hospital, tell the truth. Explain your coverage model. An honest, mundane answer protects you. A convenient fiction destroys you. Third, close the documentation gap. The audit trail records when you saw the patient and when you wrote the note. The smaller that gap, the stronger your chart. When you can't document in real time, at minimum note the time of the encounter in the body of the note, so the record reflects the clinical timeline, not just the documentation timeline. And here's a practical example of how this works in practice. I review charts before I round. I have charts open in the morning while reviewing labs and imaging. Then I go round at the bedside. After rounding, I start documenting notes and placing orders, typically starting with discharges and then working through the next batch of patients. If you have a consistent, predictable workflow pattern like this, the audit trail will reflect that pattern. And consistency is defensible. Your morning sessions will show brief chart review activity, followed by a gap during rounding, followed by longer documentation sessions. That rhythm tells a coherent story. Nursing documentation also matters here. When a nurse documents physician at bedside with a timestamp, that creates independent corroboration of when you actually saw the patient, separate from your own documentation timeline. This is another reason to consider collaborative bedside rounding. When you round with the nurse, the pharmacist, or the case manager, you put multiple people in the room at the same time, creating multiple independent records of the encounter. Fourth, stop using templates that overstate your exam. If the audit trail shows you were in the chart for 4 minutes, your note cannot credibly describe a comprehensive 14-system review. Document what you actually did. A focused, honest note is infinitely more defensible than a templated, comprehensive note the timestamps prove you couldn't have performed. And be aware that as AI tools advance, they will make it increasingly easy to identify chart cloning and copy forward patterns across a physician's documentation. Pulling pertinent clinical information forward, problem lists, histories, relevant background is reasonable, but copying a physical exam forward day after day is dangerous. Every note should reflect a modification based on the patient's actual condition that day. A copied exam is an exam that wasn't performed. Fifth, I would not communicate clinical information via personal text, full stop, but if it happens, and in the real world it does, add a note in the EMR describing the discussion and the plan that came from the text conversation. The formal record should never be contradicted by an informal one, and never ever will editorialize in text about patients or colleagues. Those words will be read aloud in a courtroom.
Rapid takeaways. EHR audit trails log every access, every modification, and the exact duration of every chart session. This data is immutable and fully discoverable.
Cell tower pings, badge swipes, and carrier call records create an independent geographic and temporal timeline that will be compared to your sworn testimony.
11 seconds of chart review time before an electronic signature is a number that speaks for itself. The audit trail doesn't just record what you documented, it records how long you spent doing it.
Text messages are discoverable through multiple independent pathways. Deleting a text from your phone does not erase it from the recipient's device, cloud backups, or carrier metadata.
Unintentional inconsistency between your testimony and the digital record is just as devastating as deliberate deception. The jury doesn't distinguish between a lie and a failed memory.
Motive narratives are simpler than medical arguments. The doctor was in a hurry wins against the clinical decision was supported by the literature every time.
Your phone is a witness. Treat it accordingly.
That's today's episode. You are generating forensic evidence every day you practice. The question isn't whether that record exists. The question is whether it will confirm or contradict the account you give under oath. Thank you for listening. This is the Charted Defense. This content is for educational purposes only and does not constitute legal or medical advice. Laws, regulations, and standards of care vary by jurisdiction. Consult qualified legal counsel for advice specific to your situation.